Okay, we're on part 4 of a series that is called The Soon Coming King, and we're going to continue in that. I'll say it again, that we are, these things are said to encourage you, not frighten you. So as we talk about, title slide, Soon Coming King, this is to encourage you, not to make you all nervous and all that. It's understandable that some would be, concerned about family members who don't know Jesus and who aren't living for Jesus. That's understandable. But at the same time, this message of Jesus coming, and I believe quickly, is meant to be an encouragement, meant to be comforting. And so if it's not, let's do some thinking about that, because it was always meant to be encouraging, and that's exactly what the Apostle Paul said in 1 Thessalonians 4, encourage one another with these words. So I want to dive into it here. Regarding the tribulation and the Antichrist, I'm still talking about this period of time at the end. Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, he will make a firm covenant. This is talking about the Antichrist during the 7 years of tribulation. I'm not going into all of Daniel chapter 9. Already covered it. But he will make a firm covenant, an agreement. Today we would call that a peace accord. With many for 1 week. 1 week equals how many years? 7 years. But in the middle of the week, that's 3.5 years, he will put a stop to sacrifice and offering. So the temple will be operating. Jews will be sacrificing. That'll drive PETA nuts. They'll go crazy. But 3.5 years into it, the Antichrist will stop the sacrifices. And the abomination of desolation, he will go into the Holy of Holies, will be on a wing of the temple until decreed destruction is poured out on the desolator, which is the Antichrist. So that's what's going to happen in the tribulation. Jesus referred to what Daniel talked about in Matthew 24:15. So when you see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, and it goes on from there. So this is what is being talked about in the middle of the 7-year tribulation. We've kind of talked about that. I'm giving this by way of review. So question, when we look at world history, again, the Antichrist is going to bring peace with a peace covenant, what we would call a peace accord. But when we look at world history, I'm asking this rhetorically, what precedes peace? And the answer is war. So what could possibly happen, and even more possibly what's likely to happen to bring war, is Israel launching a preemptive strike on Iran's nuclear capabilities. That is a very real possibility. Israel will not allow Iran to have a nuclear bomb because it is an existential threat. Existential means having to do with your very existence. Israel will, I'm telling you, as sure as you're looking at me, Israel will not allow Iran to have a nuclear bomb. It is an existential threat. It threatens their very existence. And the Islamic, we call it Iran. The proper name of Iran is the Islamic Republic of Iran, has vowed to annihilate Israel. Here's an article from the Daily Caller. This is from May 21st, 2012. Iran's military chief of staff, Major General Hassan Firouzabadi, quote, this is what he said: the Iranian nation is standing for its cause, and that is the full annihilation of Israel. That's what the head of their military has said. So what is the mission of Iran? The cause, its cause, what is Iran standing for, is the full annihilation of Israel. The New York Times article from May 3rd, 2020, that's just 5.5 months ago. Iran crosses a key threshold. It again has sufficient fuel for a bomb. Again, that's just 5.5 months ago. So when Israel denotes that they're about to do it, they're about to have it, Israel will launch, I believe, a preemptive strike upon Iran. That will set off a war, and then the Antichrist comes in to make peace with Israel and all that. So can you prove that's what's going to happen? No, I can't prove it, but it's very, very, very likely that is what's going to happen, and I believe that'll happen fairly soon. Now, let me go back to the timeline that we talked about, except I'm compressing it a little bit just to that rapture in the 7 years. So we start off here with some things: the rapture, a war that starts, a peace accord because of the war, and then the temple rebuilt. Number 1 and number 2 could be flip-flop. It may start, and then the rapture. I'm not sure exactly. But that's what kind of starts the 7-year tribulation, are these elements. Then in the middle of the 7 years, we talked about what Jesus talked about in Daniel, the abomination of desolation. He comes into the Holy of Holies and desecrates it. And then after the 7 years, the second coming of Christ. Now, the temple has to be rebuilt, but it's not as big as it was with Herod's temple. Revelation chapter 11 and verse 2. Revelation 11:2. When he talks about measuring the temple, he says this: but exclude the courtyard. Now that's key to understanding this. Exclude the courtyard outside the temple. Don't measure it, because it is given to the nations. In other words, that area around the Holy of Holies, the holy place in the Holy of Holies, will be not owned or not taken possession of the Jews. It'll be taken possession of. That area, as in the Temple Mount today, is not owned by them particularly, is given to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. 42 months is how many years? 3.5. So this temple won't be as big as Herod's or Solomon's temple, because it won't have the outside courtyard. That's why it will fit on the present-day Temple Mount. Some people have said, well, how can they build this big temple on the Temple Mount when you got the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque on top of there? And the answer is, it's not going to include that big courtyard. For example, let me show you a picture of Herod's temple, or a diagram of it. So at the time of Jesus, that's what it looked like, and this says Gentiles' courtyard, or courtyard of the Gentiles. Then you come in where the priests, and then you come into a holy place, and then you come into the Holy of Holies. However, that's not what it's going to be. Herod's temple minus the courtyard will look like this. It'll just be this section. So when they just build this section on the Temple Mount, it'll be much smaller. And that's why they're going to, when they build the temple, it will be able to fit on top of the Temple Mount which exists today. Let me go back to the timeline of Daniel's 70th week, the 7 years, and I'm adding something here called the two witnesses prophesying. So the Bible talks about in the book of Revelation that God's going to put two of his main witnesses that'll prophesy to the earth, to humanity, for the first 3.5 years of the tribulation. Let me read that to you, what's going to be happening with these two witnesses. Revelation chapter 3, verses 3 to 6. I will grant my two witnesses authority to prophesy for 1,260 days. How long is 1,260 days? 3.5 years. 3.5 years, 1,260 days, 42 months, all the same, 3.5 years. Dressed in sackcloth. These are the two olive trees and the two lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth. If anyone wants to harm them, fire comes from their mouths and consumes their enemies. If anyone wants to harm them, he must be killed in this way. They have authority to close up the sky so that it does not rain during the days of their prophecy. They also have power over the waters to turn them into blood and to strike the earth with every plague whenever they want. Now that's interesting. So these guys are going to have real authority here. And that's going to be a very interesting time. Now, some people believe, most scholars believe that these two witnesses are going to be Elijah and Enoch, because Elijah and Enoch are the only two human beings that never died a physical death. Enoch was just transported up into heaven, as was Elijah. And the Bible says in Hebrews 9:27, it's appointed for people to die once, and after this the judgment. And because Enoch, and it's interesting that both Enoch and Elijah, both of those men were prophets that prophesied about God's coming judgment, both of them. So it's interesting. So the theory is, we can't prove it, we're just giving some information out. It very well could be that these two witnesses, because they never died a physical death, would be Enoch and Elijah. Some people say it would be Moses. That would be a bummer because Moses already died once, and I just can't imagine up in heaven God saying to Moses, you're going to have to go down and you're going to have to die a second time. And Moses say, but I already died once. Yeah, you're going to have to die a second time. Sorry about that. It could be. I just don't think it's going to be Moses. I think it's going to be Enoch and Elijah. All right, whatever. But it's because of their power and authority that they're using their authority during the first 3.5 years of the tribulation. And because of their authority and the supernatural things that they are doing, the Antichrist has to allow them to build the temple and kind of be sweet. Follow me? These two guys are prophesying. They're doing miraculous things. If anybody gives them any guff, if anybody resists building the temple, they just call down fire and plagues and all kinds of stuff. And the Antichrist and the nation say, okay, build your temple. I remind you that the true church, true believers are out of here. We're in heaven during this time. And I'll talk more about this week and especially next week. But then something happens after 3.5 years of the two prophets, the two witnesses prophesying. Something happens. Revelation chapter 11, verses 7 to 11. When they finish their testimony, they're prophesying to the earth. This is what God's doing. They allow the temple to be rebuilt. But when they finish their testimony, the beast that comes up out of the abyss will make war on them, conquer them, and kill them. This is the two witnesses. Their dead bodies will lie in the main street of the great city, which figuratively is called Sodom and Egypt, where the Lord was crucified. That's Jerusalem. And some of the peoples, tribes, languages, and nations will view their bodies for 3.5 days. There's no way that could happen without television and satellites. All the nations and tribes and peoples of the earth could not view at one moment their two dead bodies without satellites and television. Anyhow, for 3.5 days, and not permit their bodies to be put into a tomb. They're just going to let them lie there. Those who live on the earth will gloat over them. Ha, 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 we killed God's two prophets. And celebrate and send gifts to one another because these two prophets had tormented those who live on the earth. Very interesting. So remember, this happens after 1,260 days, 3.5 years. So now that the two prophets have been killed, the Jewish temple has been rebuilt. There's nothing that stops, with them out of the way, there's nothing that stops the Antichrist from now doing his abomination of desolation. Since those two guys are out of the way, now the Antichrist has no restraint, and he can go in and do his sacrilege in the temple, the Holy of Holies. He desecrates it, the abomination of desolation. But then something happens after 3.5 days. These two guys are dead 3.5 days. Their bodies are lying in the street. But something interesting happens to their bodies after 3.5 days. You say, this is fantasy. No, this is real. I mean, maybe you'll spot it from heaven. I don't know what God will allow us to see. Revelation 11 to 13. But after 3.5 days, the breath of life from God enters them, the two witnesses that died, and they stood up on their feet. I would say that would be interesting. Great fear fell on those who saw them. I bet. Then they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, "Come up here." They went up to heaven in a cloud while their enemies watched them, kind of like Jesus when he ascended. At that moment, a violent earthquake took place. A tenth of the city fell, Jerusalem. 7,000 people were killed in the earthquake. The survivors were terrified and gave glory to God of heaven. It's becoming real at that point. Becoming very, very real. And that, 3.5 years into tribulation, that starts the last half of the 7-year period called the Great Tribulation. Now remember, true believers will be caught up to Jesus in the air before that, 3.5 years before that. We're enjoying the marriage supper of the Lamb up in heaven, true followers of Jesus Christ. Those who aren't true believers and followers of Jesus Christ will be left on the earth for literally 7 years of hell on earth. Now, some people say this, that the believers, Christians, those who are true believers in Jesus Christ, will not be raptured at the beginning of the tribulation, but they will go through the tribulation. And what will happen is very similar to the book of Exodus, that they'll just be protected from all the evil that's happening. Anybody ever heard that theory? That we'll go through the tribulation, but God will just protect us, just like the Israelites in Egypt. Except that I don't think they're reading their Bible, those that propose such a thing. Here's Revelation 13:5-7. The beast was given a mouth to utter boast and blasphemies. It was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. 42 months is how many? 3.5 years. We're getting it. We're getting it. It began to speak blasphemies against God, to blaspheme His name and His dwelling, to those who dwell in heaven. And it was permitted to wage war against the saints and to conquer them. So to think that the saints are going to be protected during the 7-year tribulation is a fantasy. The saints are not protected during the 7 years. Most of them will be killed. Most of them will be martyred. So the idea that God, is just going to protect the saints during tribulation is absolutely not true. Now, the second coming of Christ occurs at the end of the 7-year tribulation, and then the millennial reign of Jesus Christ starts. The 1,000 years of Christ's rule on the earth begins at the second coming. The fact is, there are actually 2 raptures. One at the beginning of the tribulation and one at the end of the tribulation. The one at the beginning of the tribulation is with believers, when we are caught up with Jesus in the air, called the rapture at the very beginning. The other one at the end of the tribulation, that rapture is for unbelievers. Now here's what I mean. At the end of the tribulation, true believers in heaven, we're the armies that are up in heaven, talked about in Revelation 19, that ride down with Jesus to conquer. At the end of the 7 years, Revelation 19:14, I talked about this last week, the armies that were in heaven, that's us, followed him on white horses wearing pure white linen. So the true believers simply at the end of now I'm going to the end of the tribulation, we ride down with Jesus. If you remember I can't go into everything I've talked about in the past, but Jesus comes down at the second coming and he stands on Mount of Olives. From Zechariah, Mount of Olives splits. We're with Jesus. And then what? And we start the millennial. So we come down with Jesus, and what happens at the second coming? We just stay on the earth, and it's the unbelievers who are raptured out of the earth. Would it make sense for us to ride down with Jesus at the end of the 7 years, second coming of Christ? Believers come down with Jesus. He stands on the Mount of Olives, and then, oopsie, we got to be raptured up in the air again, and then come back down to the earth. Does that make sense to anybody? Maybe a good time to say no. So, we come up and meet Jesus in the air at the beginning of the 7-year tribulation called the rapture. But at the end of that, we come down with Jesus to the earth. He sets up his millennial kingdom for 1,000 years. And what's taken off the earth at that time are unbelievers. Well, Pastor Tom, I'm not sure about that. Let's go to Matthew 13, 24-30. Parable, wheat and tares. He presented another parable to them. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. And while people were sleeping, his enemy came, sowed seeds among the wheat, and left. When the plants sprouted and produced grain, then the weeds also appeared. The landowner's servants came to him and said, "Master, didn't we sow good seed in your field? Then where did the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he told them. "So, do you want us to go and pull them up?" the servants asked him. "No," he said, "when you pull up the weeds, you might uproot the wheat with them. Let them both grow together until the harvest." It's at the end of the 7 years, second coming of Christ. "At harvest time, I'll tell the reapers, gather the weeds first." Key. "Gather the weeds first." The weeds are the bad guys. "First, tie them in bundles to burn them." Didn't say that they'd be burned there just at that second. It just says they'll be gathered together to burn. Doesn't say they'll burn right then. "Gather them together, tie them in bundles to burn them, but collect the wheat in my barn, which will be the earth for 1,000 years. Now, the disciples come to Jesus a little bit later, and they're intrigued by this parable. So they come to Jesus and they say, "Now, what did you mean, Jesus, by that parable? Explain that to him." And so in verses 36 to 43 of Matthew 13, he does. "Then he left the crowds and went into the house. His disciples approached him and said, 'Explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field.' He replied, 'The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed, these are the children of the kingdom.'" Okay, there'll be plenty of people getting saved during the 7-year tribulation. Lots of people will be getting saved during the tribulation, as you can imagine. My goodness, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, a half hour after the rapture, there's going to be a buzz on the earth. Where did these people go? And it's going to dawn on people, and they're going to fall on their face and receive Jesus, because it'll dawn on them that they missed it and it was all true. But then you have 2 prophets prophesying for 3.5 years about God's reality and about Jesus the Messiah. Many Jews will be saved. Yep, the weeds are the children of the evil one. And the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age. The harvesters are angels. Therefore, just as the weeds are gathered and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels. And who are they going to gather? At the end of the tribulation, send out his angels, and they will gather from his kingdom all who cause sin and those guilty of lawlessness. It's those who are gathered out of the earth at that time. They will throw them into the blazing furnace, where they will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. That comes later at the final judgment. Then what happens when, at the end of the 7-year tribulation, the wicked are taken out? Well, that only leaves the believers to shine. And verse 43, "Then the righteous will shine like the sun in their Father's kingdom," the millennial kingdom. "Let anyone who has ears to listen." So it's the wicked and unbelieving and unrighteous that are taken off the earth at the end of the tribulation. The saints just stay on the earth for the millennial kingdom reign of Jesus Christ. Now, when will these things take place? I alluded to that last week. I'll just remind you. Jesus said this in Matthew 24:34. "I'll tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things take place." And so last week we talked about what is the definition of a generation scripturally. And then we went to Psalm 90:10, and we said our lives, according to Psalm 90:10, our lives last 70 years, if we are strong, 80 years. So a generation of people defined scripturally is either 70 or 80 years. But what do you start 70 or 80 years from? What year? From when? What time point? When does the gun go off on the starting gate? Last week we talked about 1948, when Israel became a nation, as the anchor point in time to begin the last day's clock. That's the point of time when these things take place. These things start to take place. The regathering of the Jews. So I can't emphasize this enough. End-time prophecy starts when Israel, in fulfillment of 2,500-year-old prophecies, Israel is gathered again as a nation, becomes a nation again. Ezekiel 36:24, for I will take you from the nations. That couldn't be talking about Babylon because that was only one nation. That couldn't be talking about the regathering after the Babylonian captivity. This has to be talking about after that. Nations, plural. I'll take you from the nations and gather you from all the countries. Again, the Babylonian captivity was only one country. And I will bring you into your own land. Amos chapter 9, verse 14 and 15. I will restore the fortunes of my people Israel. They will rebuild and occupy ruined cities, plant vineyards and drink their wine, make gardens and eat their produce. Just as a caveat, if you were to go to Israel today, it's one of the most lush places you could be. Lots of vineyards, lots of planting. You would never believe it looked like that 100 years ago. I've been to Israel 5 times. You cannot believe what it looks like with the farming and agriculture. It's unbelievable. Most of the flowers that grow in Israel are exported into Europe. I will plant them on their land, and they will never again be uprooted from the land I've given them. That couldn't be talking about the first regathering of Israel after Babylonian activity. Because you remember, after Babylonian captivity, they were dispersed again at 70 AD when the temple was destroyed. No, this is talking about later. That's talking about now. That's talking about 1948. They will never again, he's going to bring them together. They will never again be uprooted from the land I've given them. The Lord your God has spoken. Has to be talking about 1948. Isaiah chapter 11, verses 11 to 12 says this. On that day, the Lord will extend his hand a second time. The first time was the regathering of the Jews from Babylonian back into Israel. But now I'm going to extend his hand, the Lord's going to extend his hand a second time to recover the remnant of his people who survived from Assyria, Egypt, Pathros. Now in parentheses, I'm starting to give you where those countries are. Pathros is Upper Egypt. Cush is Ethiopia. Elam is Kazakhstan, which is a province of Iraq. Shinar, which is Macedonia and Babylonia. Hamath, which is a city in west-central Syria, and the coast and islands of the west, which if it's west, it's Lebanon. He will lift up a banner for the nations, and watch this, gather the dispersed of Israel. He will collect the scattered of Judah from the 4 corners of the earth. That is a regathering of all the Jews from the world back into a nation. Just 4 years ago, 2016, thousands and thousands of Yemenite Jews, that is to say Jews from Yemen, immigrated to Israel. They made what is called, in Israeli terms, Jewish terms, aliyah. Aliyah is a term that means coming back to the land of Israel. That's just 4 years ago. It happened, it's been happening right away. Now, let me give you the population of Jews living in Israel. In 1931, there were 175,000 Jews living in Israel. Last year in 2019, 6,100,000 Jews. Is that a 100% increase? No. Is it a 200% increase? No. Is it a 1,000% increase in the population of Jews in Israel? No. It's a 3,500, that is to say 3,500% increase in the population of Jews in Israel. We figured that, Debbie and I figured that out this morning and verified it, but I mean, our 2 brains together mathematically equals a half a brain, mathematically. So I think I figured that out correctly. That's an astounding amount. Now, we already talked about the significance of these 3 prophecies. Isaiah 66:8, a nation born in a day. Jeremiah 16:14 and 15, they will come from the north, from Russia, which they have. Luke 21:24, the Jews regaining control over Jerusalem from the Gentiles. All these things came together, started to come together at the second gathering of Israel, but in 1948. 1948 is when the starting gun fired. Joel 3:1 and 2. This is a pivotal prophecy. Yes, in those days and at that time, the word at time means in that season of time. When I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem, I will gather all the nations and take them to the valley of Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat means God will judge. God has judged. That's what it means. The valley of Jehoshaphat is between the Mount of Olives and the Temple Mount. All right? It's in that little valley. Jesus lands on the Mount of Olives. There's a valley up to the wall of Jerusalem. And he says, I'll gather the nations and take them to the valley of Jehoshaphat. This is at the end of the 7-year tribulation. I will enter into judgment with them because of my people, my inheritance, Israel. The nations have scattered the Israelites in foreign countries and divided up my land. And there's a reckoning coming at the end of the tribulation. So the valley of Jehoshaphat is the valley between the Mount of Olives and the Temple Mount, and Jesus will land on the Mount of Olives at the second coming to execute judgment. Here's the thing: when will this confrontation in the valley of Jehoshaphat take place? It says, in the days and seasons of Israel being restored. All of this has to take place after Israel comes back as a nation and is restored. And as I said last week, a generation of perhaps at the most 70 to 80 years means that from 1948, if it was 70 years, all of these things would have to take place in 2018, 2 years ago, but they haven't. So at the far end, 80 years plus 1948 would be 2028. But as I said, you have to take from 2028 minus 7 years for the tribulation. That means the rapture, the tribulation, the armies coming down with Jesus at the end of the 7 years, the war that takes place in the valley of Jehoshaphat has to take place in the year 2020 or 2021. Jesus said we wouldn't know the day or the hour, Matthew 24:36. Now concerning the day and hour, no one knows. But he never said year. You don't see the word year in there. Last month, and I want to talk about prophecy starting to be fulfilled. We'll continue next week. Last month, July 2020, just last month, Hagia Sophia was officially converted into a Muslim mosque. I've been to this mosque. I stepped inside of it. When I was in the Air Force, I was stationed in Turkey, so I had the opportunity to go into these places. And now you're going to say, what's the significance of this church being converted into a mosque? I'll get to it. Hagia Sophia, the word Hagia means holy, Sophia means wisdom, used to be the largest church building in the world. In 1453, Muslims conquered Constantinople, named after Constantine. It was Christian at the time, and converted that St. Sophia's into a mosque. That was at the spread of the Ottoman Empire. In 1934, at the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, a secularizing Turkey under Ataturk, he became the president of Turkey. He wanted to move away from Islam and make it a secular nation that was more modernized. And at that time, St. Sophia's was converted into a museum. All right? It remained a museum until July 24th of this year. That's just under a month ago. Christian paintings of Jesus and Mary were covered over with curtains. And on July 24th, Turkey's top imam, Ali Erbisk, carried a long sword up the stairs of Hagia Sophia, and in a ceremony marked Islam's rich history in conquest. You see, a sword represents conquest. Muslim worshippers and Turkey's top political brass filled St. Sophia to worship and celebrate this 1,500-year-old UNESCO Heritage World Site, Hagia Sophia. So what's the big deal? Why is this noteworthy? In the ceremonial dedication and converting of Hagia Sophia into a mosque, The president of Turkey, just last month, said something interesting. This is from Jerusalem Post, July 11th, 2020, just a month and a half ago. Turkey's President Erdogan vowed to liberate Al-Aqsa Mosque from Israel after resurrecting Hagia Sophia as a mosque on Friday. That would have been July 11th. Al-Aqsa Mosque, now let me just stay on this. The president of Turkey, I think Turkey's pivotal in this time. I wouldn't be surprised if Erdogan becomes, someone who makes peace with Israel. But the president of Israel of Turkey says, now that we've converted St. Sophia's into a mosque, the next thing we want to do is liberate Al-Aqsa Mosque from Israel, from the Israelis. Al-Aqsa Mosque is located on the Temple Mount near Jerusalem. This is the Temple Mount. That's the Dome of the Rock. Western Wall is here. Al-Aqsa Mosque is this one right here. The president of Turkey says, now that we've converted Hagia Sophia into a mosque, the next thing we want to do is liberate this from the Jews. That's very, very key. This is a very important, this is the Muslim in Islam. This is Islam's third most holy site in the world, that mosque. They say that Muhammad was transported there from Mecca on a night journey into this mosque. That's why it's so important to them. Now remember what President Erdogan said. He vowed to liberate Al-Aqsa Mosque from Israel after resurrecting Hagia Sophia. So after converting that, he's going to liberate Al-Aqsa Mosque from the Jews in Jerusalem. Make no mistake about it. Turkey and President Erdogan has set their gun sights on Jerusalem. And it sets up a possible war very shortly. And I believe possibly Israel will take a preemptive strike on Iran shortly to negate their nuclear capability, and that's when Turkey and President Erdogan comes in and does his peace thing. But it's under a ruse. It's a total ruse because he wants to take control over this. But he brings peace for 3.5 years, and the temple is rebuilt up here somewhere. That little part of the temple is rebuilt somewhere, but then at 3.5 years he goes in and takes control of it, and we have the abomination of desolation. Now, when will some of these things take place? Let me rephrase it. When the rapture takes place, why are you so certain, Tom, that it's going to be before the tribulation? Give us more evidence, and I want to cover that next week.